Should you switch to filming in 60p instead of 30p?
No, God! No, God, please, no! No!
Should you switch to filming in 60p instead of 30p?
No, you should not switch to filming in 60p just for the sake of filming in 60p, nor should you film in 30p for the sake of filming in 30p. I personally like to present all of my content at 24 frames a second. Sometimes I'll shoot at 30p, sometimes I'll shoot at 60p, sometimes I'll shoot at 120p. It just depends on how much of a slow motion effect that I want. But ultimately, I want to display all of my content at 24 because I really like the look of 24. So don't just arbitrarily switch your frame rate just because.
If you're not familiar, we're talking about the frames per second in video.
Oh, we're familiar.
But standard TV in America is 30 frames per second, and as a result, that's kind of become standard for YouTube videos.
The standard refresh rate in the United States is 60 hertz, and the standard traditional frame rate is 30 frames per second. But that doesn't mean that the content was necessarily shot at 30 or shot at 60. A lot of the content was shot at 24.
But some of the new cameras, like the new GH5, the new Yi 4K Plus, the new Phantom 4 Pro and Phantom 4 Advanced, they all support 60 frames per second video, and I love it.
One of the main reasons these cameras shoot at 60 frames per second is to slow it down or conform it to 30 frames per second, or probably what's more popular would be to conform it to 24 frames per second.
We've switched, but let me tell you why, and then you can decide for yourself.
All right, lay it out for us. What are the reasons?
First, I know there's a ton of people out there who are watching this and they're already writing an angry comment. They're like, oh, I hate 60p, it looks weird to me.
Yes, 60 frames per second displayed at 60 frames per second does look weird for certain types of content. You cannot deny it. It looks weird. It looks odd.
And I mean, they're not wrong.
So if it looks weird and we're not wrong and you agree, then what's the point?
But this is not something inherent in humanity. It's a conditioning that we've had. We have spent decades watching the very best films ever made, and they're all shot at a low frame rate, usually 24p.
I think it goes a little bit deeper than just conditioning, but we'll get to that in a little bit. As for the conditioning argument, yes, it is true that most of us are used to seeing certain types of content displayed at certain frame rates, and it's going to take a lot to undo that conditioning. Certainly more than a YouTube video or a couple people uploading something at 60p. When you're watching cinema, when you're watching movies, people are still shooting on film because of the look and the aesthetic. 24p is not going away anytime soon. So to transition and to migrate to an entire new acquisition frame rate of 60p and recondition all of our brains to accept that as normal is going to take a lot of work. But like I said, that's not the only reason.
And along with that 24p comes a certain amount of smoothing, because usually with 24p, you're shooting at a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. And if there's action, well, that's a slow shutter speed. As a photographer would know, you'll end up with some action blurred.
And here's where the argument really starts to go off the rails into photography land, which is very different than filmmaking and video production. There are similarities between the two, but you cannot deny that there are some radical differences, especially when it comes to motion. Photography is worried about capturing one still image. Most photographers don't want a lot of motion blur. It can add a certain sense of movement and motion to the image if that's the particular aesthetic that you're going for. But most of the time, photographers want to freeze the action. For video, for filmmaking, you never want to freeze the action unless you're doing some kind of matrix bullet time effect. And even then, the camera would be moving and you'd want some kind of motion blur, because motion blur is what your eyes see. Your eyes do not see a series of static pictures or individual exposures all stitched together. There is blur in your natural human vision.
So we're filming this now in 60p, and maybe I look a little smoother, but there's not really any action because I'm just holding still. And that's going to be the case for a lot of video. You can shoot at 60p, but you're not going to notice much of a difference.
Even if you're not moving, you're still going to notice a difference between 60 frames per second and 30 frames per second and 24 frames per second. And that's because that frame rate dictates the shutter speed. When we're using a 180-degree shutter angle, the frame rate determines the shutter speed, and thus the frame rate determines the exposure. So even if you don't have any movement whatsoever, that 60 frames per second is still going to have a different exposure than 30 frames per second or 24, and you're going to have to compensate with one of the other ways, whether it's removing ND filters to brighten it up, opening your aperture, or increasing your ISO. Changing your frame rate changes your shutter speed.
People think switching to 4K added a bunch more detail, and it did, but not as much as you might think. Because if you're shooting at 30 frames a second, then there's going to be a lot of motion blur in between frames, especially if you're shooting with a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second.
Of course, when you slow 30 frames per second down 10 times slower, it is going to be choppy. Just like the 60 is going to be choppy, not as choppy, but you're slowing it down 10 times. You don't have those frames in between. The normal speed of 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second is exactly that, per second. That's how many frames you're seeing per second. When you're slowing these things down, all of a sudden you're introducing extra variables, and now you're reducing it to maybe only 10 frames per second, 5 frames per second. That's going to look really choppy because obviously that's not a situation you would actually do with real footage. If you're watching at normal playback speed, it looks just fine.
Now, you could up that shutter rate and get sharper images, but then your video is going to look choppy. So by doubling the frame rate to 60p, you can use a faster shutter speed and not have it look choppy. And that faster shutter speed is going to give you more detail.
Not only can you increase your shutter speed when you increase your frame rate, you absolutely need to increase your shutter speed when you increase your frame rate. Like we already said, when you increase your frames per second, you have to increase your shutter speed to follow the 180-degree shutter angle rule. 180-degree shutter angle is always set, it's always 180, but that is not shutter speed. You can't just set your shutter speed to 180 or 100 or 60 or 120 or whatever you want. You have to determine it based on your frame rate to get accurate motion blur for the speed that you're going for. And yes, when you increase your shutter speed, you're going to get less motion blur. But like we already talked about, sometimes you want motion blur. In fact, in video, you almost always want some kind of motion blur so it looks real, so it looks authentic, so it matches what the human eye sees. For photography, that's not as important because it's only one image. So if you're pulling a still image from video, then yeah, crank your shutter speed through the roof. It doesn't really matter. But if you're playing something back for the purposes of being live action video, you want motion blur in that. You don't want to get rid of motion blur. It adds in more detail, but it removes the motion blur, which makes it look less real, less authentic.
So 4K 60p will be the first technology that will really unleash the full detail of 4K video.
I'm not even sure what that is supposed to mean. Shoot at 4K resolution or higher if you prefer to get as much resolution as possible, and then shoot at whatever frame rate you want for that slow motion effect. If you want it super slow, shoot at 120, shoot at 360, shoot at 1,000 frames per second, whatever it is, doesn't matter, and then conform it to something that's going to look the way you want it to look, which 9 times out of 10 is probably 24 frames a second because most of us want our footage to look cinematic or filmic or good or high quality, and displaying something at a super high frame rate is not going to look the best. It's probably going to look a bit cheaper and a little bit more amateur, which Tony's going to get to in a second.
Let's talk about The Hobbit, because they filmed The Hobbit at 48p, which is twice the usual film's 24p, and people hated it. They just hated it.
Yeah, they hated it because it looked weird, it made people sick, and no one likes watching something displayed at that high of a frame rate. Same thing with 60 or even higher at 120. It looks weird, and this goes back to that we are conditioned to see stuff at a certain way, and when you do an experiment like they did with The Hobbit where they're shooting at a high frame rate and displaying at a high frame rate, it makes people feel uneasy and they don't like it. I don't know if you remember back in the day, but Best Buy used to have these displays where they'd show off the new 120 hertz or 240 hertz television sets, and they'd play Pirates of the Caribbean at a super high frame rate. Now, the movie wasn't shot at a high frame rate. They were just adding in digitally extra frames in between, and it looked really weird. Anyone walking by the display would look at Pirates of the Caribbean and say, why does that look so odd? You may also notice this whenever you go over to a friend's house or a family member's house and they have one of these 120 hertz or 240 hertz television sets, and they have this like film mode usually turned on. The first thing I do is turn it off because it makes everything look like garbage, and you can notice it immediately. Most people in the room, if they're more of just kind of a regular consumer, don't always notice something wrong, but they might think that it looks weird. Maybe they have it on for sporting events because I know that's really popular, and sports are a totally different realm. There's different types of content, so it's not always a hard set rule if you always want to do it one way. So that's why you definitely don't always want to do it the other way of shooting it everything at 60. You don't want to do that. That would be a mistake.
And part of it was because you did get all that extra detail, and that made people feel like they were sitting at a Hollywood set.
When you're shooting at these really high frame rates and then displaying at these really high frame rates, it can be a little bit of a mess, especially if the content or the subject matter doesn't necessarily fit a high frame rate format.
Instead of being immersed in a fantasy land. And that's how much of a difference that extra frame rate makes. It also makes it harder for actors to emote convincingly, because it turns out a lot was hidden in that choppy 24p or 30p and that little bit of blur. It just hid a lot of details, and having all that revealed is great.
Watching a movie at 48 frames per second or 60 frames per second is kind of that uncanny valley effect, like looking at a CGI human being. You can't quite put your finger on it, and most consumers, regular people, can't put their finger on it, but you know something's off. It's not quite right, and it doesn't make you feel that good. People who are in the industry like us, we know, oh, it's a high frame rate and that's why it's got that particular look. But your regular person isn't going to be able to say like what it was. They're just going to know that they don't feel good, they didn't like it, and they didn't enjoy the experience.
If you're a YouTuber, if you're somebody who's sincere and you're YouTubing and you're not acting, if you're shooting sports, if you're shooting wildlife, any sort of action, landscape stuff, beauty stuff, but acting, film, a little more challenging.
So here's where Tony starts to walk it back and says that 60 is really good for YouTubers and sports and all these other things, but maybe not films and not movies. But why? Why wouldn't you want your sports and your fashion and your stuff to look cinematic? Isn't that what we've all been chasing for the past 20 some years since digital came around? People want their stuff to look filmic. That's why they want cameras that can shoot at 24 frames per second. If you release a camera onto the market nowadays that doesn't shoot 24p, if the GH5, which he's talking about, that shoots 60 frames per second, didn't also shoot 24, there would be riots in the streets. People want their stuff to look like movies. They want it to look like film. Now, that's not to say that you always want it to be 24. Sure, there are certain situations where you may want to display something at 60 frames per second, like a sporting event. I can totally see that if you want to watch an NFL game or you want to watch some high-speed action, then yeah, display it at 60 frames per second. But even for YouTubers who are just putting together vlogs, behind-the-scenes videos, just talking head stuff, what is the purpose of having it at 60 frames per second? If you've seen the 60 frames per second stuff on YouTube, it looks really weird. When the GH5 was first kind of officially revealed and Griffin put out the ice sculpting and ice cutting video at 4K 60, I think most people thought it looked kind of weird. I would have much rather preferred to see that displayed at 24 frames per second and all of that content slowed down. Still shoot it at 4K 60, just conform it to 24 so it's a little bit slower and we get that nice dreamy dramatic effect rather than this like no motion blur, hyper real, hyper movement. The thing about 60 frames per second, when displayed at 60 frames per second, it almost looks like it's playing back a little bit too fast because your brain is getting extra frames and it's still cramming all that extra information into the same span of time. So it has this weird illusion of looking sped up or too fast when it still is regular speed.
Okay, so maybe you don't want that extra smoothness. There are still really practical reasons to shoot in 60p. One is to go for that dramatic 50% speed look. When we got the GH5 with 60p, the first thing we did was filmed a fake pharmaceutical ad, just because we realized it would be so easy to kind of fake that drama.
Shooting at a high frame rate and then conforming and slowing it down is one of the best tools in any filmmaker's kit. It works for weddings, it works for commercials, it works for corporate video, it works for all sorts of things. There's always situations where it's advantageous to film at a higher frame rate. The problem in the past was that most people were limited to lower resolutions, 720 60 or 1080, 1080 60, 1080 120 in certain situations. But now that we have 4K 60, it's a lot nicer to have all that resolution and the extra frames to slow down and use to our advantage.
I see it all the time in music videos. Just slow it down 50%, you get instant drama, and it's pretty cheap. It's a real budget way to get good production values.
To say that it's a cheap effect is really only by modern standards. Now that the GH5 is so affordable and we can do 4K 60 for only $2,000, that's fantastic. But only a few years ago, that same effect at that resolution would have cost you tens of thousands of dollars. So it's not a cheap effect by any means in terms of the impact it has on your wallet. And as for being a cheap gimmick or a cheap trick to make your footage look better, well, that's just the same as saying Photoshop is a cheap way to make your photos look better. I guess it's a cheap trick, but you're going to do it anyway because that's what you need to do to make that particular look. If you're doing fashion photography or you're doing wedding photography, you're obviously going to run it through Photoshop to make it look its best. Same thing with filmmaking or video. If you want something that's slow motion, you're going to shoot it at a higher frame rate. You're not just going to shoot at 30 frames a second or 24 frames a second and slow it down from there, because that's going to look like absolute trash.
Another thing I find really practical is to be able to stretch our B-roll. Every pro has had some point when you didn't have coverage, right? Now you can slow your B-roll down to 50%, most people won't notice, and it is instantly twice as long, covering your ass. Pretty good deal, right?
Yes, shooting at 60 frames a second to get those extra frames and then conforming and slowing it down to 24 or 30 to get extra B-roll is a great idea. But now we're going back to displaying stuff at 30 frames a second or 24 frames a second, which previously we talked about was too choppy or something. So I don't really understand what the benefit is now. If before 30 and 24 were too choppy, now we're shooting at 60 to get extra B-roll, but we only get that if we're slowing it down to 30 and 24, which you said were choppy. So I'm confused. Should we shoot 60 or should we shoot... What do you want us to do?
So overall, the increase in our production values has completely offset the small gain in storage costs and the costs of the new gear. That might vary for you though.
My biggest issue with this video is that it is a photographer giving video advice, and I think it takes for granted what the video production and filmmaking people actually spend a lot of time on. I am very meticulous about what frame rates I shoot and why I shoot them. If I'm going to shoot at 60, there's a very good reason for that. And if I'm going to display something at 60, or if I'm going to display something at 24, or if I'm going to shoot at 120, or if I'm going to shoot at 24, these are all very specific and intentional decisions that I make project to project. There's nothing that I can just say across the board, oh, I just always shoot at 60, or I always shoot at 24, or I always display at 24. It's per project, very intentional, very specific decisions that get made. It's just like saying to a photographer, oh, well, you've got all these megapixels now. Doesn't that mean you just got all those different focal lengths built in? Can't you just zoom into the photo? You just take one wide shot and you've got so many megapixels, you can punch in and crop in, and you've got a medium shot and you can crop in even more and get your longer focal lengths. Can't you just do that because you got so many megapixels? It's like, no, you have different lenses for different reasons, and you have longer focal lengths and you have shorter focal lengths for very specific and intentional reasons. I don't think there's any photographer walking around out there who just only takes wide shots and then crops in for the longer focal lengths. If that person exists, I'd be curious to meet them and talk to them and understand why they do what they do. But when we're talking about these technical tools, they have a very specific purpose and they have a very specific creative function in terms of the aesthetic and the artistic image that you're trying to make and that you're trying to produce. So when I see videos like this and there's just these kind of blanket statements or kind of advice that maybe would apply to a regular casual person who probably isn't watching a YouTube video on it anyway, I want to be very careful about the information that gets out there and what people are consuming, because if you go to shoot everything at 60 frames per second and you just say, oh, I can always just conform to 24 frames after the fact, what are you going to do about sound? Because all of a sudden your sound gets slowed down, and there's no way to actually necessarily fix that. You could shoot at 60 and then just play it back at 24 and not conform it, and then you're just basically chopping frames out, but then you don't have motion blur. Now you can go in After Effects and add motion blur back in, but now we're getting into a very complicated process that really didn't have to be that way. If you had just shot it at the frame rate that you wanted to shoot it at, because you had a very specific reason to do so, then you would be fine. You wouldn't have to do all the post-production work. Just like with photography, you can save stuff with Photoshop and Lightroom, and you can change your white balance if you're shooting raw, and you can tweak your exposure. But 9 times out of 10, it's best to get it right in camera. Same thing with video. We want to make sure that that shutter speed is right in camera and that it makes sense when someone's going to be watching it at whatever frame rate it's going to be displayed. So just really keep that in mind. Don't try and do any like quick and easy, just always shoot it one way and you'll be fine. You really have to understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and make those intentional decisions so that your footage actually turns out to look its best.